G'day and welcome to my literature review, my top 5 articles of 2017. I'm Nathan Carter and I'm a biomedical technician at Northeast Health in Wangaratta. So the area of interest that I've picked up in this literature review is around ECG machine auto-interpretation within an ECG management system or a clinical information system and how that enhances clinical workflows. I think we're perhaps all familiar with a paper-based record of an electrocardiogram, an ECG, and how clunky these systems have been conventionally in the management of paper-based records and storage. So I'm going to have a look at through my top 5 articles. We're going to examine how a paper-based record is essentially replaced by an electronic clinical record and the enhancements that this can be made to clinical workflows. My search methodology to find my top 5 articles of 2017 started essentially where most searches begin, in Google. Essentially it was a broad search initially as I narrowed it and targeted my searchable words, key search words, to find essentially more targeted responses. So initially I started with ECG innovations, safety of ECG auto-analysis and patient wearable technologies. This resulted in a number of articles, some aged and most of which weren't peer-reviewed nor current, and that led me to the next search strategy, which was back through the Melbourne University EBSCO Discovery Service and Clinical Key, where through the informatics search keyword, I came up with the International Clinical Medical Informatics Journal. What a fascinating read, and online I could review all the articles from 2017 and 2018, which essentially the bulk of my articles came from, with the exception of one. So the rationale I applied for selecting my top 5 articles of 2017 was essentially from the 30 or 40 articles that I read. Effectively, the ones that stood out were interesting to me, and I suppose they were because they were directly related to my field of work, which is in ECG information systems, as I work as a biomedical technician with ICT responsibilities. Of course, the articles also had to be peer-reviewed, and the articles were, of course, current in the 2017 year. So the first article, the safety of computer interpretation of normal triage ECG or electrocardiograms. So typically ECGs fall into 2 categories, normal being that the patient is effectively well, or abnormal, where there might be an arrhythmia or some sort of abnormality picked up in the interpretation of the ECG that requires further an escalation and review by a senior clinician. So typically all ECGs are placed in front of the nose of a clinical clinician for interpretation and approval. So effectively this is an interesting study because it discusses clinical workflows. So how the workflow can be enhanced by removing the requirement for normal ECGs to be approved by clinicians, effectively done by the machine. So in this study, ED doctors were asked to read and report on ECGs within 10 minutes of a patient presenting. Effectively, 855 ECGs were studied, 222 of which read normal by computer interpretation. 13 of the 222 were deemed to be something other than normal, i.e. abnormal, by the attending cardiologist. Of the 13, only one of the normal was actually deemed to be abnormal, and the patient was prescribed bed rest. So effectively what we're talking about is a very high incidence of quality of the ECG reading that can enhance the clinical workflow and diminish the requirement of clinicians to look at ECGs, especially that are classed as normal. So from a clinical information and informatics point of view, I think there is a the study demonstrates that this enhancement could be further examined and explored. Of course, this was only one study and further clinical endorsement would be required. Carrying on from the last article is, I said that was actually about quality, but the previous one was about quantity more so. This is about quality, so the role of the computerized diagnostic proposals in the interpretation of a 12-lead ECG by cardiology and non-cardiology fellows. So in this article, or perhaps this article and the study, it set out 100 clinical 12-lead ECG traces were examined, including normal and abnormal ECG traces. So again, much like the last one. 15 junior cardiologists and 15 non-cardiologist fellows interpreted the ECGs under a number of different conditions. So here we're talking about whether or not there was a computerized proposal. They're calling it a proposal, but it's an interpretation that is presented on the paper-based ECG or the electronic ECG that can support decisions of clinicians. So back to workflow, back to both the efficacy and the efficiency of the workflow. So in this particular study, there was a computerized analysis proposal. There was also the absence of a computer analysis proposal, and where 4 proposals were put forward, so 4 interpretations on the ECG, one of which was correct. So that is effectively there to test the clinician's capacity to read the ECG. So the availability of proposals, the outcome of which increased confidence in the accuracy of human interpretation. So the interpreter was more likely to be accurate when the proposal was accurate or multiple proposals were presented. Therefore, there is a great capacity with where a proposal or multiple proposals are there to enhance the clinical outcomes and increase the efficiency of that clinical workflow. So to this point, we've talked about ECG proposals and we've talked about ECG computerized analysis, but we haven't really looked at how ECGs are stored and effectively the digital clinical repositories with which they sit in as opposed to a paper-based system. So effectively into a ECG management system that might be standalone, or perhaps it's into an EHR or an EMR feed, whereby multiple ECGs and serial ECGs, so that is ECGs taken at a previous episode of care, can be examined by a clinical user for comparative analysis. Now, this particular article, does the adoption of electronic health records improve the quality of care management in France? France, of course, being a first world nation, it was largely applicable within the study. It was thought to be equally applicable to other first world countries. So it was a retrospective study that looked at 3 national databases and examined the association between the use of EHRs and the features. So the quality of the patient record, the delay in sending information at hospital discharge, pain status evaluation and nutritional status evaluation. Effectively, we're talking about workflows, clinical workflows. So clinical and enhancements to those clinical workflows resulting from the addition of an EHR. So the takeouts from this particular was that there was the benefits of the EHR represented an important layer to the quality of care management in hospitals, and due to there was an increased adherence to guideline as well as disease surveillance and monitoring, and it decreased medication errors. So in essence, clinical workflows were enhanced as a result of having an EHR, of which a digital clinical record such as an ECG can be stored and reside there for review. One of the more prevalent impediments to integrating a clinical information system surrounds mismatches. So in the example that we're talking about here is about ECGs. existing in a clinical information system to support clinical workflows. This one of my top 5 articles, Identifying and Eliminating Inefficiencies in Information System Usage, a lean perspective, looks at how lean practices can be applied to avoid what they term wastage in the article. So patient information mismatches frequently occur between information systems. This can be avoided with in ECG repositories or ECG technical capacities by using barcodes. So again, we've interacted and we've interfaced to clinical systems like a hospital, patient administration system, and a ECG management system through the use of an inquiry, perhaps an HL7 inquiry with a barcode to transfer patient information directly to the ECG and avoid any straight to the ECG management system and avoid any user requirement to key in user fields. So the impeded workflows can be a negative impact on the safety and effectiveness of care delivered to patients, and the article examines mismatches directly observed in a large hospital and looks at the wastage as a result of those mismatches. It looks at a number of manifestations of waste and how they were observed. It was basically classed into 8 types, which won't be discussed in this literature review because it was quite exhaustive. But effectively what this article looks at is that the knowledge and that it supports the redesign of IS to better match workflows to effect a safer and more effective and efficient patient care outcome. So back to clinical workflows, we are effectively considering redesign and how clinical practices can be better enhanced through redesign to avoid mismatches and information management. And rounding out my top 5 articles of 2017, the other side of the coin, harm due to the non-use of health-related data. This was an interesting paper, essentially a discussion paper that considers the implications of non-use of clinical information or the underutilisation of electronic health data to assist clinical decisions to achieve better patient outcomes. So it examined the breaches and misuse of health-related data and that have serious implications as the emission of health data using such health data presents those risks. And the article considers the non-use of health-related data. It's often difficult to assess, and we don't know the reasons why. Possibly they are related to technological capacity within the hospital or aged and disparate systems that aren't particularly integratable. And it considers the benefit of a steady move towards a socially responsible reuse of data becoming the norm to save lives and resources. And it also stresses the importance that ICT must place on systems being interoperable to enable communication for data sharing, and therefore it's prudent to invest in this area, ICT. Often there's a heavy reliance on ICT to roll these systems out and then support them, as well as a change management tool as well. So there's a lot of reliance placed on ICT in this area. So the recommendations resulting from my top 5 articles is that computer-interpreted ECGs classed as normal has the potential to reduce interruptions to clinicians and advance patient care, that further research is required to support the adoption of computerized ECG interpretation to triage normal ECGs as a standard clinical practice, and that ECGs stored in a shared clinical information system for comparative analysis improves clinical workflows, reduces waste, and improves patient care. Thanks for watching my literature review into my top 5 articles of 2017. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you next time.